Hello everyone, today we talk about the emergence of permanent armies, a contentious and controversial topic, at least when we argue with modernists regarding how things happened, right? Especially, I believe that the modern era did not exist. The Middle Ages ended between the 18th and the 20th century. However, there is a logic behind the notion of permanency as far as a professional military is concerned that goes in parallel naturally with the statal build-up of the later Middle Ages rather than actually even just the early modern age, because yes, of course, things did increase in the 16th century and beyond, but let's say the fundamentals were already established basically in the 14th, 15th centuries. So today we look at how the nuclei of permanent armies were established. By the way, predictably in the stronger powers of Europe during the late medieval crisis, trying to explain why. For example, in the 13th century there were much larger armies than at this point in history, but why those weren't, and so there was actually much more absolute wealth around, right, to ideally build a permanent force, but why this instead was affirmed exactly in the moment of power shrinking, and obviously the necessity, say a crisis moment that, as you understand here, self-explanatorily enhanced the reason to seek like some more reliable force that you could maintain as a core of essentially of national power beyond what had historically been the call to arms across the entire country that at some point especially in late medieval times was yet to be recompacted after the crisis. This of course entails all a specific understanding of late medieval politics and institutional development that if you're particularly interested in, I advise you to check out in the medieval government playlist that deals exactly with this stuff. People tend to watch that content less, but it's foundational really, right? It makes you understand why, of course, the military was the one it was, and the ways the sovereigns of Europe looked at the situation and took action in order to strengthen a central power that was being actively challenged, and preparing some videos about this, by the same nobility. And so those who had historically also provided and would keep providing the backbone of the military, we're talking the higher nobility at large, in a political sense, the actual backbone at least in a numerical sense of the military, were the small aristocrats. I also made videos about this. It's important to think at different levels in a non-dichotomic way, or at least in one where there are so many factors interplaying that today we will partly observe, mostly from a military point of view. So the term standing army carries with itself invariably some ambiguity, making it essential to clarify its meaning, right? At least since the early 14th century, it's evident that within sufficiently extensive territories there were consistently stationed forces capable of maintaining internal order, capturing criminals, enforcing the decisions of political and judicial authorities, and ultimately providing a minimal garrison for fortified structures. This is true since ever, right? We've seen it even for the Sumers, right? There was a household force, which, as we will learn today, it's partly what, especially after the mid-14th century crisis, professional forces tend to remain permanent from, although it's not the entire story, especially when we talk about larger armies that are the dreaded free companies that will play a role in that. I just made some videos on the topic. Again, all this is completely random, but it's great that we can sort of tie all this content together, talking more or less about the same issue from different angles, right? So standing armies always existed, arguably. Even the Huskars were a permanent force. Everyone who basically lives under somebody's rule, being maintained by the Lord, that provides them with the equipment to go at war, and takes care of things when it gets rough, is there since prehistory. Everybody did that. There was always a level of standing army in that regard. Modernists tend to say, no, standing armies are something that are just born with the Renaissance centralized state. The Middle Ages was just an anarchic, dark pit of nothingness that we don't want to even acknowledge. This is basic ignorance also, and especially because, in fact, permanent forces did not lack in these centuries. But modernists also tend to make a strange trick, which we'll partly observe today, because we will stick mostly to the 15th century. That is to say, in fact, identifying just in the latter part of the Middle Ages this alleged advancement, and essentially neglecting, this is also broader historiographical problems, the bigger armies of the 13th and the first half of the 14th century were actually much bigger, and actually entailed a much greater power concentration, and that did display a degree of permanence, right? There is something about this that I specifically studied. I mean, the idea of what is a standing force to begin with when we talk about armies in general, because in the 15th century, the standing forces were actually smaller than the ones available, say, in the early 14th century by the same major powers in Europe, except we know a bit less about the former from a documentary standpoint, meaning that, of course, there wasn't like the same level of, if anything, monarchic concentration. It wasn't much the fact that it was less state. As a matter of fact, it's the other way around. But first, there are more distant times. At the same time, there is more, again, wealth availability, and with that, a capacity to constantly upkeep even several thousand men at arms. This is the case for just countries like France, Milan, Verona, partly Naples. But so it's definitely just the largest armies in Europe that, in this sense, contribute in a qualitative sense to the development of standing armies, right? Rather than, but this would have been mirrored on a different scale also pretty much everywhere at this point, because actually these forces all across the continent were not really raised, upkept, and employed in particularly different, fundamentally different ways. But those bigger forces are often neglected, and modernists fundamentally focus just on the permanence of the institution, which is a different story. It doesn't look essentially at military power, it looks at permanence of essentially administrative, bureaucratic forms of some sort. It's also, again, stemming from this obsession for your historian, the only thing you should do to be respectable is to visit archives without actually studying the fundamentals of evidential history that have been forgotten by our generation of historians, and in fact require a great deal of revision and offer, in fact, an enormous amount of room for maneuver, let's put it this way. So when we look, in fact, at the previous time, we realize that in numerous instances across various regions, armed groups managed to sustain their existence over many years, sometimes receiving support from states and other times relying on their own resources. Recently, as I was saying before, we made a video about the free companies with a particular cut on France, because that was the country where, say, the greatest level of fragmentation, of disorder and anarchy, especially after the Battle of Poitiers and the end of the hostilities with the Treaty of Bretigny, brought to this war bands to Rome a leaderless France. John II had been captured in the aforementioned battle, and he was actually still administering France from England, imprisoning, right? But this also entailed like enormous astronomic really ciphers to ransom the same king. The Jacquerie, the widespread peasant revolt, pretty much triggered by the English chevauchée. And so this most obvious evidence that feudal society had failed, at least in the establishment, in the leadership, the subjects that had been working to maintain all those magnificent knights that were instead defeated and could not protect them anymore. We have observed how in that context there were many, not particularly large, in fact pretty much geographically scattered war bands that managed to literally install themselves, a little temporarily, but still too long for being like a normal and especially healthy thing for the broader system, in local castles abandoned by the French monarchy and or simply seized because of the power vacuum that had occurred during the crisis. And so you have literally some of these companies living off the land and or installing themselves in specific seigneuries, substituting the local lords. It may seem strange, but actually the very first permanent armies that we recognize in that aforementioned institutional continuity that especially modernists like stem exactly from this dynamic, right? And it stemmed from probably the French monarchy that had problems with the same forces. As we've seen under Du Guesclin, for example, many of the, for example, English paid, we could say in part also Gascon, Anglo-Saxon forces, Anglo-Gascon forces that had fought against the French passed over to the latter. Whenever like France would be able, in fact, to reboot and pay enough, because it was still a giant system. Great part of the width of the crisis stems from the fact that France was that actually pretty solidly unitary country that depended on the monarchy and so suffered together with it, but had less likely to see this monarchy down to begin with over time. And over time, in turn, like these companies, they weren't just these turncoats, let's say, but there were free mercenaries out there, mostly were French, etc. But the nucleus of permanent forces would develop in France that we call like, this is really the beginning of standing military in France, stems from the continuous maintenance of some of these free companies, the more loyal to the crown, simply from those that had already been employed, mostly as garrisons to defend from the English raids, and thus billeted in the various towns that they had to defend, while others disbanded. There wasn't nothing like, okay, so today we establish a new army, really recruit a national force of volunteers that really want to defend France. So no, of course, it stemmed from what was the elementary picture of the time, the one following the crisis that had brought to all over Europe to this radical loss in power from the commoners' side, that in part were abused. Yes, they were co-opted into, okay, well, now you have to pay even more for maintaining an effective military during the time of crisis was, generally speaking, understandable, but that if you really see it in, I would say, like moral, political standpoint, is actually also a concession. It's something that the same commoners simply conferred over to the authority in terms of sacrificing part of their liberty in exchange for protectors. This is in many ways how also in the High Middle Ages the knightly class had been established, and as long as you're alive you can pick up weapons, as the same Jacquerie showed. Like, it means that in the moment in which you're still breathing but you accept that somebody else is going to war in your stead, you have to work to upkeep him so that can also lord over you and managing your resources. You are conferring some of that power. There's no difference between like being lorded over and accepting the situation, as long as you exist and you don't do much to free yourself from that. This is a topic pertaining mostly to another very interesting branch of history, that is to say, a bit the psychological side of the story that is very difficult to reconstruct, as you understand, but that can be explained, as we know that's not like the peasants were always seeking to revolt, right? When the chance occurred, they would, but they also failed, as the Jacquerie proved quite bluntly, as they were objectively incapable. They lacked really the tools, the awareness of how to do so, even though they controlled the entire sort of productive system. And in part, this was because their mental structures, somebody would say, were actually complacent with and compliant with the established order. Guess why? Because that order made a freaking lot of sense, right? It's not based on intimidation, repression, and oppression, right? It's also about that, because nobody is really an angel here. But there is also functionality that brings, for example, France to win the war, that brings revolts in the same England, regardless of the extraordinary victories that the English score, as you know, during the war over their foes. So it's a complicated topic. Again, I have other videos incoming from a strictly political point of view on the period, because the cycle here brought us unexpectedly to some 14th, 15th century history concentration that was really necessary at some point. Today we talk mostly, as we said before, about the latter, though. So in a period that does not take much into consideration what had been going on for generations now. But there are great examples of how fundamentally even a Roman army could maintain itself in a strictly political institutional standpoint. The best example for this is Italy, right? Because of different reasons we'll understand now. A notable example is the company led by Micheletto degli Attendoli, which I also made a video on. If you look at the Battle of Caravaggio, we will see him in action, which operated for a period of a fourth of a century, essentially from 1425 to 1449, serving successively in Florence, Naples, Venice, and under the Papacy. So basically almost all the peninsula. And even during intervals between missions, Micheletto's company preserved its cohesion and maintained a consistent administration, notably represented by the Chancellor and Treasurer. We discussed this all in the recent videos on the free companies. That actually does not discuss the condottieri, as a matter of fact. It's another chapter. I made some videos, but we must make many more of them about this enormous topic. And this company essentially achieved this through contracts lasting 1 to 2 years, significantly longer than the previous century's condottieri agreements, allowing Micheletto to utilize his company more effectively than was previously imaginable. This first half of the 15th century witnesses the institutionalization of the compagnie, of the condottieri, especially in a country like Italy that was not like France, that although divided, was still France. Right, you could have the English in Gascony, launching chevauchée all over the center and the south, lost practically to monarchic control for a prolonged amount of time, rebellious Burgundy, Brittany, etc. But it's still France. It's still an overall system. It's very complex, very big, but basically there is one big boss and then various vassals that more or less try to do shady things. Italy is different. Italy is also, again, very developed, very rich, but it's different states, right? Namely, that there are kingdoms as well. Naples is a kingdom, is also a big one, one of the greatest powers in Europe. There is namely an Italic kingdom that, however, here does not quite work anymore, if not within the theoretical institution of the Holy Roman Empire. And you have some properly self-founded regional powers like the aforementioned Florence, Naples, Venice, Papacy, Milan, that are very rich, again, and can afford, given the, as you understand, more sort of swinging, pendulum of balance between these powers that basically do not manage to take over one another, to pass these companies from one another that needed, as we've seen from these contracts, maybe just for a couple of years to have that army there. And we're talking about entire armies. There's not mortiers, there's not fragmented companies that tour around. Italy had witnessed that itself, not just France, in the previous century. Also for that, we've seen that differently from France, and in spite of the local devastations, the Italian soldiers of fortune era is very much like ruled by still the same Italian powers that throw these companies against one another. And in fact, the proof is that you do not find practically anything like in France where war bands roam places without any counter or even installing themselves somewhere. The Italians do not allow these companies to settle. Most of the foreigners, because at that time they had been mostly strangers that had entered the peninsula, including from the 100 Years' War truces like Bretigny, they do not take root, right? They come back to their originary country. And from the 70s and the 80s, nearly all condottieri are Italian at that point. So that's yet another very interesting dynamic. There is technically no major invasion at this point. There are some dynastic disputes at some point in different... the most sort of foreign state here was Naples, right? Because it belonged, as you know, to foreign dynasty historicals. You have the connect, you have the Hungarian expedition, but it's mostly like an inside system. So until the end of the 15th century, the Italians managed to preserve their own independence from external powers, and it would also continue actually in large part, regardless of their loss in the Italian wars. But the point being that they can maintain this balance because they have enough money to spend for these temporary forces that objectively seem, for someone who's very rich and that does not want to invest in, for example, some local military that can maybe take over power because you arm the citizenry, the peasantry. And the Italians had that in the previous called communal era, as we've seen. This is something that the lords, the signori, do not like very much. And since they still can afford top-notch forces like the condottieri that are in this sense apolid, but they're still from the same region, they hired them temporarily, and they just go on like this. And in the process, as a matter of fact, this is especially true for Venice, that has really the best army of the era, together with the bande d'ordonnance of Charles the Bold. There is a gradual, almost enfeoffment, right? At that point, yes, with the same Italians, they start to settle them, to rely on them, even if they are still sort of private companies by name under this mercenary commanders, but they fundamentally side with this or that power, and they establish this interesting relations also between antagonizing condottieri that competed with one another, even within the same ranks, etc. These forces are also understood to be essentially the beginning of some permanent army, even though the Italians had really started earlier. For example, Philippe de Commines, that surely knew something about warfare from the 100 Years' War in France, openly states that the French companies of ordnance are established by the French kings, imitating the one of the great lords of northern Italy. And if you go 1 century back in time, you realize from reading chronicles like Villanis, etc., that, as we said before, basically the lords of Milan, of Verona, etc., had the same amount of, individually, not as a sum, individually, the same amount of forces that the French would have. They were the strongest military in Europe. So imagine, but I have a video incoming on this showing literally the income of the in fact, richest monarchs in Europe, I think, in the first half of the 14th century. So it's very fitting as an example, because that's what Villani was talking about. That really shows you the scale of this wealth and how they could afford such forces. And as I often say, the more I go on teaching this stuff, the more I realize that people do not have any clue of this. Like, they literally have never heard that these were such robust powers, and especially why. The 15th century is in many ways more popularized, more fascinating. At least the condottieri reached their peak. But if you look at this first half of the 14th century, actually you see even something more developed. Surely, especially in the second half of the 15th century, there is a tendency, we'll see it now all over Europe, to have actually more forces available, whether or not permanent or not, semi-permanent to a degree, in the tens of the thousands. So it's something more regimented. But as I was saying at the beginning of the video, these are not larger forces than the ones existing at the end of the 13th century, at the beginning of the 14th. The difference seems more, in a broader civilizational perspective, the necessity of, in the crisis, having enough forces you can rely on in a very sort of grounded, say, structural sense, through statal administrative systems that allow you to just a constant amount of wealth being collected from your dominions. That is over this entire military system floats, as opposed to the previous century, where it was mostly about, okay, we have to raise an incredibly large amount of money at a given time. We do have it, and we must make this temporary fort, but these forces are not going to be, even though they're going to be virtually permanent, as those aforementioned Visconti and de la Scala ones, but they will not actually correspond to a fully formalized and structuralized permanent standing army in a categorical sense. Also because, by the way, in that time, this is true also for the French. If you look at them in the first phase of the 100 Years' War, including the video made about the Battle of Poitiers, many of the troops they used were foreign, specifically German, so both in France and in Italy. So these guys, as we've seen, do not actually take root there. I mean, some would have surely kept living and would have died eventually in these countries, but at large, there is no such thing like they install themselves as lords there. They come back home, which adds a bit to the sort of nomadic life. This is migration era, by the way. If you look at it from a German perspective, great crisis, medieval civilization, but the relatively less developed parts of Europe bring these mercenaries in. Again, it's very similar to what happens in late antiquity with the Federati, to an extent, at least by geographical, sort of international political relations. Now, going back to our time, some strategically significant strongholds were for extended periods defended by full military units rather than just a few guards. That's, as we were saying before, what brings the French to fundamentally formalize in the mid-14th, from the second half of the 14th century onwards, some of these companies as framed within a broader French military that will not disband them when the season was over. This was exemplified by Calais, which remained garrisoned even after treaties or long truces with France and Burgundy were established, which, considering its strategic relevance, makes a lot of sense. So exposed to both, in fact, the English and the Burgundians, and capable of controlling the channel. In the latter part of the 15th century, the garrisons employed by France under the reigns of Charles VII, Louis XI, I made multiple videos about their reigns, and Charles VIII were specifically organized as small cavalry forces known as Petite Paille and Morte Paille, right? Because they essentially, and I made an entire video about this, it's called like the from semi-permanent to fully permanent military forces. They're exactly this second half of the 15th century in France, Spain, and Italy in comparison, so it's really useful. So petit or mort means like so smaller, like just continuing pays that are not the full one, right? So these are small cavalry forces, but for those time standards, they're not simply guards, right? They are literal professional soldiers that you keep there as a strategic force to maintain different strategic settlements across France. Especially these are troops that are readily available to be brought together into a larger force, together with also the more traditional forms of recruitment across the country when an emergency arises, right? In fact, this deployment had been very contentious already because, of course, it cost very much. The nobility that were the ones who were trying to sabotage the monarchy did not want to pay for that because they could not use their own soldiers to make periodical uprisings. Instead, the French monarchy manages to impose itself on them. By the early 16th century, and we've seen this from our Tudor warfare videos, I have others, by the way, incoming, the English monarchy consistently maintained an army of 2,000 to 3,000 men spread across approximately 100 strongholds, with Calais, Dover, and Berwick-upon-Tweed being the best fortified. You understand, of course, why these locations, they had all eminently strategic relevance at the controlling the strait, and also like in the north, the frontier with Scotland on the more traffic, say, road, like that could supply a frontier, a border force. 3,000 men is not really much. Again, if you compare this to French or single Italian forces in the first half of the 14th century, realize they had up to 5,000-6,000 men at arms. Right here, we're talking not even specifically men at arms. Of course, warfare is changing a little in terms also of tactical specialties. So we're talking really between the 14th and 16th century different. It's 300 years. This was, however, a lot for England at the time. Consider this is after the defeat in the 100 Years' War. We've seen from 16th century English warfare how Britain started to lag a bit behind compared to continental development. In fact, England in the first half of the 14th century was one of the greatest and richest monarchies in Europe. At this point, it's not quite so true. As well, in fact, they had pretty big armies at the time. So this may sound jarring, but I say it because, again, people tend to study this from, just as the beginning of the growth of a modern army. And so say, the Middle Ages, look at how few they were at the beginning. But they had been actually much bigger during the Middle Ages. And this down represented by the late medieval crisis is always skipped, is always deeply misunderstood as far as also the military extraction and organization and purpose of these forces. In any case, in the classification of permanent military forces, the significance of bodyguards should not be overlooked. As I said at the beginning, even if you look at 11th century familia, right, you can see definitely, and I made a video about, for example, the one of Henry I of England back in the day, virtually the finest forces in these realms, right? When we look at the post-mid-14th century, we realize a noticeable increase in these bodyguards. It's true overall that especially for the less sort of power-concentrated countries in proportion, these bodyguards will be a bit the core of national armies. And if you look at Poland, for example, these were countries we'll come back on soon. And as we've seen, they had lost basically monarchic power to the elective diet, right, to the nobility. There was a monarchic power, but it was heavily controlled and limited, in fact, in its military growth and exploit, regardless of the fact it was surely the strongest in the kingdom. The sum of the nobility was sort of heavier when, of course, a broader national emergency arose. Forces would unite, but the point is always the same. Where do I find the money to maintain these forces? Right? It starts all from also the political cooptation that a monarch, just for being a monarch, and so the highest authority, politically, judicially, and militarily in the kingdom, can simply attract and can bring these forces together through. This is true again since ever, right? Even if you look at the older war bands, it's always the same. So these were de facto bodyguards of the specific leaders. It's as if, I don't know, the various officers were in turn in the army, like the chieftain with the retinue, right? In the way they evolved also in later history. Now, from the mid-14th century onward, many princes began to surround themselves with one or more chosen groups for personal security, at least an enhanced force compared to previous times, which, due to the excellence of the cavalry, especially, and the luxury of their attire and uniforms, also served to showcase the magnificence of their rulers. This fact of liveries, of this proto-uniforms, and more like something I highlighted in different videos. Also made a video about the various English nobiliar houses of England during the 15th century, not just the monarchy, that naturally was the more affluent, but in fact the same higher noblemen's entourage retinues that were sort of mini monarchies on their own, standardizing their soldiers' appearance, having them more recognizable, just even as a propagandistic ideological show-off right in front of even the commoners, etc. Now, these guards we're discussing now are not, especially in the West, the say the veritable backbone of the royal army that can count again on substantially larger amounts of soldiery that are not guards, right? They're the kings in many ways, because it's the king that is de facto paying them, also through public means, but also through his own purse, mostly this guards, but at large, like, he would try to contribute in different ways when possible. In order to have a functional national army, you must have the entire country paying for it. So, at the time, the West had sort of the best power concentration. Again, Central Europe already was more dispersed power-wise, so it's another story. But the guards are interesting as well. There are many units. I never think made a video about late medieval Renaissance unit guards, but they are really fascinating in different ways because they would actually fight on the battlefield as well. We talk about the Janissaries from the Ottoman side, but that's another story. I mean, the West has a very interesting tradition of this as well. These forces exhibited a more overt military appearance compared to traditional ushers, sergeants at arms, and halberdiers who continued to maintain order at court, right? So they were something more than mere bodyguards. They were effectively the king's own in battle as a tactically autonomous force. Nevertheless, distinguishing between this established category and the new one can sometimes be challenging as well, right? Because at different times, different kings would establish different guards units, would disband others. We've seen this also for the French musketeers in much more modern times. I made a video last autumn about them. But talking about this, for example, medieval period, the papal court during the Avignon period had a guard of 100 to 150 individuals, quote, constituting the protection for the sovereign pontiff and elevated the splendor of his court. Right, so 150 guards. This would have not been men-at-arms, so it's not really a large military force of any kind. However, like, it still did make numbers. Overall, there are all security reasons also in the preservation, in the defense of fortresses. There is, by the way, and never forget this, in parallel with the mid-14th century crisis, actually a shrinking of armies, but a tendency, for that reason, given also the political instability of coups, right? The idea that you can seize cities just with surprise attacks at night. So there is a refinement in that kind of attempt, but in part it's also because, yes, things have become relatively more unstable. You need these guards also for broader security reasons, right? So it makes a lot of sense. Less forces venturing out there, but just investing in the maintenance of your own, of the order, right, in your own settlements. This is incredibly important. Again, in a Europe where universal powers are shrinking and, generally speaking, a lot of investment is coming back to the land after the big financial crisis, this is also a shift like in military focus. Now, speaking of these Avignonese papal guardsmen, by the way, the group included, quote, masters of the ushers, or, quote, major porters, along with lesser ushers and door guards. Additionally, at least 50 sergeants at arms, or halberdiers, established during the time of Benedict XII, were responsible for escorting the papal entourage, enhancing the palace's internal security, apprehending delinquent clerics, overseeing prisons, and performing certain tasks on behalf of the apostolic chamber. These troops were frequently recruited from the nobility in the 15th century. As you understand, cooptation from monarchs that tend to have different families tied to their own destiny. We've seen how even in some of the most troubled countries, like, Castile, where was plenty of nobiliar revolts, etc., at the end of the day, when there is a high nobiliar class and enough, say, power from the monarchic side, you see these powers growing in tandem, giving each other tough time, but also growing together, not ending up somewhere sclerotic where essentially the state implodes into some elected monarchy and nobiliar takeover, right? Now, lastly, there was also a third group comprised of the Pope's squires or gentlemen, which reinforces this nobiliar participation, also from lesser aristocrats, right, that are eager to rise through the ranks to get. This is a way to again install, to balance the high nobiliar power with the social enhancement of the smaller nobility. They were pretty also good at war, as we've seen, so they were there to fight. They were hungrier and angrier, more capable and ambitious to an extent. The martial element is distinctly evident in the case of a figure like Gaston Phoebus, Count of Foix, who surrounded himself with a military entourage of approximately 200 knights. This is fairly a lot for an individual nobleman. It tells you how powerful the French principalities really were. This aspect is even more pronounced in the case of Richard II of England, whose bodyguard had grown by the end of his reign to resemble a small army. This seemed obvious. Again, there had been a major crisis in even the possibility of levying large amounts of troops, like in the previous centuries, of tens of thousands of men. So if you had not been able to, these traditional means were over, you needed to rely on people who had a more personal connection with you, right? Monarchies become more fragile, they're more challenged, and so the king requires even more permanently at hand forces at his court, following him everywhere in battle, but not only. To further his political aims, Richard II began enlisting armed men in the Principality of Chester. From 1397 onward, he actively worked to elevate his men-at-arms who were charged with accompanying him, offering them annual compensation for their service. These are de facto permanent forces, right? You can argue that, again, the institution wouldn't quite survive with the same forms and so on, but it is something that you must take into consideration, because the systems had always somewhat been there, and or they had even been bigger besides guard units at some other time in history. By September 1398, the masters of the Wake, Vash, I think it's Wake the Chester, so-called, totaled 750 individuals comprising 10 knights, 97 squires, and 311 archers, with yearly expenses for this largely unpopular force exceeding £5,000 sterling. What is fascinating about this, by the way, is the organic, perfectly mirroring the English indentures of the time. The indenture system was, the equivalent of the condotta in England, and it reflected, again, the way companies were normally levied and or organized from, by the way, in this case, English noblemen and even kings, that thus would follow the same organizational structure. Presenting, this is really typical of the indenture. We've seen it also in other videos. Actually, very few men-at-arms compared to the archers. There are really many. Right, this speaks volumes about how also the English tactics of the 100 Years' War worked practically. Like, you needed actually a lot of longbowmen to make things work. Right, so also the notion that, again, the longbow is superior to the crossbow, that stuff has nothing to do with the actuality of warfare to begin with. It's incredibly fascinating. We will see that further at some other point. I made videos about the chevauchée armies of the English chevauchée, of course, armies of the 100 Years' War. We talked about the English army organization at large in the later Middle Ages. We will come back more in detail on it, hopefully soon. The other aspect here, as we said, is the political one. The English barons do not want to pay £5,000 sterling, because they are the ones who fundamentally, besides the king, rule England as lords of the same. The English barons are very much in control of their own respective districts, unlike in France, where there are different strata of also monarchic functionaries that form from the third estate, that form some kind of fact what would become the noblesse de robe, as a matter of fact. Also from judges, etc. England has actually, greater social simplicity, would shrink more, also as a consequence of the 100 Years' War, as we were saying. And these noblemen do not want the king, actually, to have this force to begin with. And they protest. And, that by that point, the English monarchy was already pretty much, controlled by the parliament. The 15th century saw further developments in this field. For example, in the Duchy of Milan, starting in 1420, Filippo Maria Visconti had around 600 to 700 knights known as the familiares ad arma, which literally means the familia, like this domestic force in arms, right? This is also actually an important force that tells you again how wealthy and affluent, in this case, the Milanese lords were. 600 to 700 knights can form a battle line in some medium-sized army. By 1467, the 11 squadrons of the ducal family accounted for 2,000 men. These were, by the way, men-at-arms, right? So they were really like the deal. Here, just remember, compare this to what we said before. The English in the early 16th century had, like 2,000-3,000 soldiers at large, permanently maintained to garrison basically the entirety of England. The Milanese, half a century before, had 2,000 soldiers just in personal ducal command. in Milan. This number remained constant in 1497, when all members of the family were counted, both those within and outside the immediate household. There had historically been, again, similar forces. Entering the ducal family meant to receive different tasks, also as, I don't know, even as secret agents, as police, doing things that would impose, of course, ducal authority across the land. By the way, Milan was very well organized, a very sort of uniformed country from an administrative point of view. In fact, it was the more subtle reality within the Italic kingdom. There was, by the way, already a nascent royal guard under Charles V and Charles VI in France, which expanded significantly between 1440 and the century's end. By 1511, it had grown to include 200 gentlemen of the palace, 100 Scottish archers, 100 French archers, an additional 200 French archers, and 100 Swiss soldiers, reaching a total of 700 soldiers, potentially rising to 900 if each gentleman had an accompanying combat-capable squire. All right, because these men-at-arms, of course, were part of sort of larger units that they commanded, that, as we've seen, had this missile troops, squires, etc. next to them. Here, it's all really typical from the French background, including the Scottish soldiers that came to France for the old alliance to fight against England. This was a thing since the 100 Years' War. The French enlisted lots of Scottish archers to cope with the English longbowmen, which also had an important result. The French also have some attempt on their own. We have the Swiss soldiers that will remain, as you know, up to the French Revolution, basically in the royal household. And so altogether, this is the King of France's guard under important figures from actually starting from the mid-14th century, with Charles V, Charles VI, a bit later on, until the Renaissance. So, again, a sizable force, something between England and Milan, as we've seen here. Even René II, Duke of Bar and Lorraine, who had limited revenues, maintained a personal bodyguard, which in 1496 included substantially more than 50 individuals. The Lorrainese forces we've seen in action 30 years later to put down part of the German peasants' uprising. They fielded lots, essentially, of knights still. They were sort of a very conservative type of military. And there were some of the best, say, chivalric courts in Europe. So they cared about this personal bodyguard that, however, is just 50 soldiers. That does cost, again, considering this is just Lorraine, Bar, etc. So compared to the French monarch at that point, it's not even that few. The composition of Charles the Bold's household, by the way, in Burgundy is documented in both the Memoirs by Olivier de la Marche and Jean Molinet Chronique. According to the latter, who is less elaborate, the household consisted of 40 knights and 40 men-at-arms led by 4 commanders. This is interesting because you have basically a leader, then men-at-arms and some other mounted troops, mirroring in part the same lances of the same Compagnie d'Ordonnance, and mostly the organization of these household troops would have followed the same scheme of other units out there. They were functionally the same thing. Like, the important here was to have them available by the ruler so that he could fight with them. Also in battlefield, it could be his bodyguard and so on. As you know, it wouldn't work well for Charles the Bold anyway, because he was killed in battle. But the Duke of Burgundy's household, by the way, regularly included men of various backgrounds, alongside numerous other knights of noble lineage and 20 chamber squires. So we see in part that cooptation of lesser status individuals to essentially cope against the nobility, because again, what did they have to lose? They entered the ducal household. Like, this was essentially one of the most powerful and prestigious courts and realms in Europe. They would have fought to the death anyway, right? So they would have opposed any enemy of the Duke, including the Burgundian high nobility. Plus, because these troops were tendentially self-sufficient, at least they were autonomous in their movements at war, at the court, etc. There were 50 bakers, 50 cooks, 50 marshals, and 50 stablemen, each with their own assistants, overseen by 4 squad leaders, and there were 50 royal archers commanded by 2 knights. So if you make the math, you realize that there are lots of aides, lots of people working for these guard forces that comprise 130 men-at-arms, an equivalent number of armed squires, and 130 archers, all under the command of a distinguished and a seasoned knight along with 4 leading squires. Remember, Burgundy has sort of the gold standard of chivalry, of knightly ethos. These are ultra-elite forces, some of the best men at arms in Europe, to say the least. Made multiple videos on tournaments recently. There is all like an epos revolving around the training properly of the Burgundian court knights. We will have to make way more in-depth videos on that because it's one very, very fascinating chapter. By the way, this represented the scenario during the famous 1475 siege of Neuss, which also ended up in failure. This was essentially an attempted invasion of Germany by Charles the Bold, who was also trying to get himself crowned King of Burgundy within the Holy Roman Empire. So he showed off, like there are the meetings with Maximilian, with Frederick III, and the Germans were frankly annoyed by this Valois Burgundy behavior, like extravagant expenses just to show off wealth. So you can imagine the same arms and armor of the Burgundian knights at this top elite level to have been incredibly flamboyant and excessive in many ways. It was, maintaining such household costs, even in the context of such enormous siege like the one of Neuss really was. We have around 1,000 combatants in Charles the Bold's household at Neuss, including 8, however, which is a slightly different thing, but it does give you a dimension of how, it was more or less above a half of the same French king's household. Now, Charles the Bold's ambitious nature did not cease here, by the way. A decree issued in Lausanne in May 1476 revealed that he commanded a personal guard exceeding 2,000 soldiers, which included 40 chamberlains and gentlemen of the chamber, 4 squadrons of men-at-arms representing the 4 estates or courts of the palace, 4 squadrons of guards, 8 companies of mounted English archers, and 8 companies of palace infantry. So an amazing deployment of top-notch forces. Consider that the armies of Charles the Bold were also very multinational. Lots of Germans, lots of Frenchmen, lots of Englishmen, lots of Italians. And you have here, in fact, the mounted English archers that are a very interesting feature we've seen in the English chevauchée armies organizations as well, and how they had gained fame. So made multiple videos actually about the army of Charles the Bold, especially at the very beginning of Schwerpunkt. We'll hopefully come back on the topic to expand more on it. Maybe looking at some battle, right? Because, as you know, Charles also did not went too far, at least in the major engagements that he would have needed to prove the quality of these forces. And it's not like it was a bad army, all right? But you can even have a good army, but screwing things up. Now, in the Kingdom of Castile, a formidable force of Guardas Reales was also present, comprising 893 lances, which is a lot, right, in 1481, and swelling to 1,100 men-at-arms and 130 other cavalry in 1496. This is a lot, right? So this is the Kingdom of Castile alone, by the way. I don't think it was like the sum of the dynastic union that had already happened at this point between Castile and Aragon, that however remain, in fact, different countries for centuries, right? This is really big. Castile was a giant by this point, had really cemented its not just its leadership in the Iberian Peninsula, but also like substantially large force. I made a video about Spanish army's organization of the era, 14th, 15th centuries. If you're interested in more details, go check that out. If you're interested in Castilian history, I have a playlist also for that. It shows here like the essentially chivalric feudal culture of Castile as well. England had something too at court. In 1486, Henry VII Tudor successfully created a company known as the Yeomen of the Guard, famously enough. This is after the Wars of the Roses. We made a couple of battle videos on the topic, and one about the tactics of the Wars of the Roses, beautiful chapter in English history, late medieval warfare. The war had not been particularly devastating for England, but it had decimated the House of Lords, which enhanced greatly the Tudors' monarchy capacity. So it got rid, in other ways, of that. Well, actually, the war had been fought for in many ways. Many contendants to the throne had reduced the power of the high nobility. This did help even a country that had lagged behind from the continent, had suffered important defeat a generation before against France. The Yeomen of the Guard, by the way, were a sort of third estate product, right? It was monarchic stance against the interference of the higher nobility. There were noblemen at court and in the guard units. However, the yeomen mostly embodied this, again, also old, by now already, sense of, again, the archer, the longbowman that had fought next or behind the men at arms, and that had made that combined arm tactic so famous during the 100 Years' War, really effective. So, as always, monarchs, but very powerful monarchs, tend to, of course, make leverage on the third estate, or someone who is below the higher nobility. Right? We've seen this in many circumstances, and the Yeomen of the Guard are in part this. I will surely make a video about this unit that is very famous. A historical account regarding the marriage of Arthur, Prince of Wales, characterizes them as, quote, men selected from across the nation, skilled archers, strong, bold, and fearless, donning broad damask jackets in white and green adorned with exquisite embroidery on their chests and shoulders, resembling garlands encircled by vine branches. And again, I made videos on the gradual uniformation, especially of guard units in late medieval times. If you're interested in that, you can check the playlist Military Dress out. There was a need of uniformity, again, recognition, also on the battlefield, because things were becoming ever more sort of coordinated. Armies gradually larger as compared to the ones that had followed the mid-14th century crisis immediate aftermath. And again, the continuation of the longbowmen's sort of monarchic connection, that England had, of course, archers since ever. That's why they simply start hiring what they had in that great number as well. But the monarchy also had enhanced the archery training all across England to have a reliable amount of non-nobiliar forces that could have partially contrasted them, and that in any case were mostly spent overseas. The yeomen of the guard's numbers were estimated at between 150 and 200, and swelled to as many as 600 at the onset of Henry VIII's reign. Concurrently, the king's spears were formed. These consisted instead of gentlemen by birth. You couldn't really get rid of those, and they were the best, of course, they were qualitatively compared to the yeomen, of course, better troops of noble blood. As such, they had some greater prestige. In reality, one of the aims that monarchs and princes had in founding or expanding their military houses was to provide accommodations for young nobles within their immediate entourage, thereby allowing them to be compensated, monitored, and controlled, hopefully also developing some kind of loyalty to them, or at least familiarity with the monarch, so that they would have had different reasons not to simply betray him at every useful occasion. As you know, this time in history is marked by intrigue, plots, assassination attempts, even regicides, etc. So it's not really strange to make that reasoning, like keep your friends close but your enemies closer. That fits the context. Generally, the establishment of proper standing armies occurs in a rather indirect and convoluted manner. They emerge as a result of circumstances rather than through explicit and deliberate decisions by sovereign powers. They literally come into being, right? And this is what, as I explained in videos about the Compagnie d'Ordonnance, the way, in fact, the largest permanent forces in Europe come to be. Simply companies of soldiers that had been used, as always, by the sovereign in this case, just to wage war. Instead of disbanding them, they were upkept because they had proven to be more loyal. They were billeted in some town that was threatened, and so even the locals were fine with that because they preferred to pay these guys than an enemy coming to loot, extracting patties, etc. So it does make a lot of sense. Like, it's not that medieval monarchs were not wishing for more permanent forces at their command. Had they had the political and social capacity, they would have immediately established them. But they lacked those, in fact, and so this process is very gradual. It's also, of course, accepted by the country in a way or another. Like, they acknowledge, especially in times of crisis, of threat, of external threat, especially invasion, etc., the need to provide the king with some force is out there. I mean, I'm preparing a video about Riade, and we know how long, in that sense, the Eastern Frankish princes had allowed the Magyars to simply pass through Germany and not to loot their immediate holdings, just to undermine royal authority when they thought this was too, cumbersome, too annoying. Then, when the situation starts getting out of hand, immediately they confer power to the king that even becomes an emperor, crushing the Magyars. So this is a bit the point. Like, having a strong military for your own country allows you to do lots of things. If only people understood this today, we would live in a much better and especially safer world. And those who don't want to pay for the military and conquer, this is what history shows, right? So it's pretty dumb to begin with, to pretend that there isn't also an enemy propaganda behind these positions. Now, to define a permanent army in the truest sense, several criteria should be apparently fulfilled. One, the existence of stable and consistent structures, meaning military units that function independently of troop replenishments. So units that remain over time with a tradition, it would be the later regiment especially, so that it's difficult even to trace an actually permanent institution from a formal point of view, from this late medieval armies, right? Because at large, they could even be conceived as the literal nucleus from which the rest of the army would develop from, but the ways these were organized changed over time, so you don't really recognize the same units or the same thing, but it's still a beginning. Another condition would be the commitment of public authorities to retain certain army units in active service, even during peacetime, which is very useful, especially if you have, as we've seen, for example, with France, lots of rebellious vassals. And this commitment is linked to a common belief that a permanent military force, compensated during both peacetime and wartime, provides a crucial and unmatched advantage, offering support that temporary military mobilizations cannot. In fact, that's also the crucial aspect of the pay, the professional nature of these troops, the fact that these are not just peasants that will come back, farming their fields whole, which is also a bit too much of a romantic picture for the later Middle Ages. Again, the soldiery had already been distinguished itself in a professional fashion because mercenarism was so widespread all over Europe. The peasants mostly did remain at home, even during wartime, etc. But you must provide properly with the resources and the framework for these troops to remain in your service continuously, like to replenish their arms, supplies, to like give them a future, some kind of reason to stay committed to the cause. That is mostly the salary. It's mostly the pay. There are, in fact, half pays of some sort for some kind of reservists that were former soldiers and or troops that should have equipped themselves in a particular way. There are different experiments that do not really end all in the same way, nor particularly well. France especially will have this problem of really not developing a true native infantry force until the second half of the 16th century, because it was such a deeply entrenched feudal system that they had excellent cavalry. In fact, they even had very good artillery, but they feared to arm the peasantry as levies, as, say, foretestators to become professionals. In fact, they hired the Swiss that had the advantage of, while costing indeed, but still coming back to Switzerland when the problem was over. So you didn't have in France some rebellious peasant with combatistic revanchism, social grievance, and so on. I made a video about the French Wars of Religion that in part explains this issue in that later context. You must have, in any case, soldiers that know their deal. And by the way, at this point, these forces are mostly still men-at-arms. So they're not really, in fact, pike and not just even pike and shot, but just even pike forces, all right? Not just because we are fairly early in times, just the Swiss fight like that. If anything, it's the Landsknechten in Germany under Maximilian that will be a response to that. Eventually, all of Europe will step up, and even surpassing the Swiss just by adding, in fact, the shot to the system. We talked about the Italian wars, we talked about the Tercio, etc. So you have all different combinations, mostly based on this different national, political, and social calibrations. But the center is up to the Chevalier Bayard in the Italian wars, shot dead by a falconet projectile in the spine. Like the centrality of cavalry, of knights. And if you look at the military curriculum of some of these men, like you say, what? Like some people that we don't even consider, but that they are fairly well documented by this point, and that were literally like the Rambo of the situation. Like people that you say, how is it possible that they could even fight in all these battles, in all these wars? But for many of them, it was really normal. Again, I dedicated, fortunately, already enough content to this sort of backbone, again, of the small aristocracy that really believed in the traditional duty of the military, of those who wore the cingulum militaris. Yet another precondition had to be a notable segment of the population possessing young individuals aspiring for a military career, which implies ongoing service, continuity, relocation, availability, and the sacrifice of personal freedoms such a career may entail. That's why the aristocrats were so important, because these were essentially the only element of the population who could factually afford such lifestyle in a prolonged sense. I mean, the average rank-and-file pikeman would not necessarily... I mean, he would be well-trained at some point as a mercenary if he was employed. I mean, there were some experiments gone wrong, including the legions of Francis I that were some pike squares levies that were basically useless, just used as garrisons, and eventually within the same France and then disbanded. But the nobleman was the guy who literally was born to live as a soldier and to actually make money out of it, because again, he would have himself noticed by the higher noblemen, by the king. He would acquire commissions. He would make a living in a way or another. He was already equipped with, I mean, his father would have been the same. They would have had land people, so it's not like they lacked resources just to sustain that lifestyle. There was at least a balance, if not a minimal gain from that kind of lifestyle that was already enormous for a pre-industrial society. And so a privilege. Really, I made multiple videos about this. It's Montaigne. There's a lot of philosophical reflection on the role of the aristocracy in this traditional sense that, in fact, clashes pretty much with the modernistic and secularistic notion that this was just the age of the people, right? As sort of an anti-aristocratic moment, the Renaissance. Absolutely not. It's actually the diametric opposite of it. A final requirement is the presence of adequate and regular revenues to sustain the standing force, which practically necessitates a stable tax systems that are more or less willingly embraced due to the valuable services a regular army can offer to the community. Right? This is where, in fact, the so-called modern, that did never exist, state, where it was actually a medieval state built up, comes into play. Because you must have this steady flow of cash just to pay troops, which is always the greatest issue, not just for these permanent forces. They are actually minoritary compared to the amount of mercenaries and other troops you could levy. In fact, again, some of the mercenaries some of the permanent troops are actually just mercenaries. In fact, it's wrong to use the term mercenary to begin with. The soldiery was the backbone of armies. Then you could have militia, other conscripts, etc., auxiliaries, but it was the professional companies that made the work, and some of them were royal, others weren't. Of course, the resources here are limited on the basis of which country we're discussing. Again, France, at the end of this period, is by far the biggest state, the most properly structured one already since the previous centuries, and in spite also thanks to the crisis, this great lesson in times of civilization crisis. It's not to say that the big actually loses. This is not really the case. On the contrary, very often after a crisis, the one who had tried to make counterculture properly collapses. Remember these two. Money is chronically short in this system, so it's extremely complicated just to have very good forces and being able to pay them. Think about how rebellious and mutinous the Landsknechten really were. There was probably a military ethos. By the way, how could you control them? How many times the Swiss came back home because they were not paid by their employers, right? And so it's actually a very complicated picture. You have to do so because it doesn't matter how clumsily organized these armies are, they will invade you if you don't invade them. So it's sort of always an up and down, and you put together forces the best you can. And you just have to be careful and capable enough to make this equilibristic balance save the day. And this is basically the history of the Renaissance, and not only in a nutshell. So the control systems were not actually that thrilling. You could have entire parts of your country rebelling. Think about the Bourbon defecting to the Spaniards, to the empire during the Italian wars. He would pay for that, as a matter of fact. But yeah, I mean, this is beyond like anything we conceive in contemporary terms of political territorial control of major regional powers. That's why it's also so fascinating to observe. So in summary, a permanent army should not be exclusively associated with institutional evolution, by the way, the development of the monetary economy or solely military needs. It also involves a shift in mindset, which is actually what I was thinking the most by preparing this video, in the sense that, again, the conglomeration of some forces directly maintained by a state is not much the fact of, I don't know, the state simply expand. I mean, yeah, that is the case, but also in turn, why did that happen, right? It's essentially people's realizing that if they want to be effectively protected, they must pay for an adequate military. That obviously in times of crisis is even more needed. It's not like before when sovereigns could simply cash a lot of money that was often short at the same time, but at least to a scale that could simply make them recruit, after all, some remarkable force always available around, right? Because economy was thriving, everything was rising, right? And so even if competition was tough, there was enough resources to make lots of more stuff move along the way. That's why we shouldn't just consider numbers, but rather the forces that agitated them, so to say, that activated them. In this later time, the imperative is having a force that can stand, together from an enough functional political system that requires the backing of the various estates, of the development of more, the rise of more developed parliamentary forms, the spread of a more capillary administration, right? So this is what the Renaissance state is at the end of the day. And it's big. It's an important topic. It's not like the modern era is completely an invention. There is an important development, but it's also not, in fact, simply proportional to what we've seen in the past. There was a state also in the past, but the dynamics were different. The forces behind this were different. Humanity before was less exhausted. At this point, it's heavily proven by the mid-14th century crisis that is also in turn a moral exhaustion that causes the material shortcomings, right? So it's more people abandoning arms. That's yet another very important part of the story. The state has more control, but it's also, again, because people have chosen fundamentally not to fight. These were the people whining because they paid too much for the military. They wanted the war to be over and they get taken over by somebody else. All right? And sometimes they pay harshly for it. They get reconquered, by the way, by other powers, even losing further power in the process. And thus they also start losing a simply sort of autonomous army organization on their own. I mean, there are times in history in which there are rebellions that inform statal development. This is not really the case. This is not really the moment there are, but all the major rebellions are put down and they do not bring to any improvement in individual liberty. The system is actually increasing. It's gradually coming back from the crisis. It will actually just come back by the 17th century. It was also not such an easy time, but it's sometimes even too overly dramatized. But it's mostly a matter of incapacity or seeing themselves, organizing themselves. When you have something more efficient, managed by the Lord, that is also objectively more effective statally-wise. And this is really the basis of what you will see developing uninterruptedly until the contemporary era, right? Meant truly as up to the 18th or up to the 20th century, depending on the country. And so there is a vitality of this system when both, in fact, the government and the people recognize this military as an evident and essential facet, an asset of the broader power framework, right? If you don't understand why the military is there and why you must pay for it and what kind of advantages derive from controlling other people and doing it so, especially from when you have a real advantage, you're going to go under. And that's not really a good thing for you at all. I'm glad that we're talking more about 14th, 15th century warfare. Telling you the truth, it's a tough era, right? I ended up specializing in early 14th century warfare, which is a bit more prosperous in really mindset, as we were saying. But it's important to understand. It's really crucial to understand this, but it may be even more important than the moment of expansion, because at this point there are so many things that are settled for centuries to come that had really not been there before in this way, and that are so familiarly modern that, in fact, we also tend to overly identify them with certain dynamics also of a modern era, that we lose even the point of how useful and meaningful they are for today's times. There is indeed a harsh lesson to be learned here. Like, it's not simply, okay, we're fine, everything just, will work if we do. So it takes an enormous work to make this whole thing stand, right? It's tough, it's harsh, it's very difficult to live in this world. And we can definitely learn that much simply from observation, from general analysis. I think we would have to make many other videos to fully complete this picture, because it's not simply ending here, it's interconnected with all the rest. And I would like to stress how relevant it is to understand this continuum. All right. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.